What if I told you that long before Spain ever set foot on the Philippine soil, there was already a civilization so powerful, so battle-hardened, that it had defeated over 50 rival kingdoms, and history barely remembers its name? Most people think of the Philippines as a nation that was conquered, colonized, dominated. But that is only half the story. The other half, the part they never taught you in school, is the story of an empire that won. If this kind of buried history fires you up the way it fires me up, do me a quick favor right now. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to know the truth. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Join this community and let's uncover the world's forgotten stories together. Now let's get into it. To understand what the Philippines once was, you have to erase everything you think you know about it. Forget the colonial maps. Forget the Spanish galleons. Forget the textbooks that started Philippine history in 1565. Go back further. Go back to a time when the archipelago was not a colony. It was a constellation of sovereign, thriving, fiercely independent kingdoms. These were not small villages. These were structured political states with their own legal codes, their own writing systems, their own naval fleets, and their own warriors who were among the most feared in all of Southeast Asia. The ancient Philippines was a world of competing powers: rajahnates, sultanates, kedatuan, sovereign realms ruled by datus, rajas, and sultans who commanded loyalty, tribute, and armies. And in that world, one force rose above all the others. When historians talk about Southeast Asian empires, they mention Majapahit, they mention Srivijaya, they mention the Khmer Empire. But there is a network of power centered in the Philippine archipelago that rarely gets that same spotlight. The Confederation of Madyaas, the Rajahnates of Butuan, the Kingdom of Tondo, the Sultanate of Maguindanao. These were not primitive chiefdoms. Tondo, for example, maintained active diplomatic and trade relations with Imperial China as early as the 9th century. It had its own script, the Baybayin, its own aristocracy, and a treasury filled from maritime trade that stretched across the South China Sea. But perhaps the most militarily dominant force in pre-colonial Philippine history was centered in the Visayas, and its story of conquest against rival kingdoms is one of the most astonishing tales never fully told. The Confederation of Madyaas, built on the island of Panay, was not just a political alliance, it was a war machine, forged through decades of conflict, negotiation, and domination. Its warriors, known for their expertise in Kali, the ancient Filipino martial art, fought with blades, shields, and a ferocity that made them nearly impossible to overrun. Now here is where history becomes almost unbelievable. Across the Philippine archipelago, there were dozens upon dozens of independent political units, each with its own ruler, its own army, its own territory. The dominant Philippine powers expanded through a combination of military force, strategic alliances, and political marriages. Some kingdoms fell to direct military assault. Naval battles in the shallow straits between islands were brutal, fast, and decisive. Philippine warboats, the Caracoa and the Balangay, were engineered for speed and shock. Warriors trained from childhood in blade combat would board enemy vessels and fight hand-to-hand with a discipline and lethality that stunned later European observers. Other kingdoms were absorbed through diplomacy, forced to pay tribute, to swear allegiance, to send their sons to serve in the armies of the dominant power. This is how empires actually grow, not always through fire, sometimes through the credible threat of it. The result? Over time, across generations of rulers, over centuries of conflict, the dominant Philippine confederations and rajahnates had brought more than 50 rival kingdoms under their influence or direct control. 50 kingdoms. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 50 sovereign powers, each with its own identity, each fighting to preserve its independence, and each, one by one, falling into the orbit of a civilization that the modern world has almost completely forgotten. You cannot understand these victories without understanding the warriors who made them possible. The ancient Filipino warrior class, the Maharlika, were professional soldiers, bound by a code of honor, trained relentlessly, equipped with weapons that were masterworks of metallurgy, the kampilan, the kris, the sundang. These were not crude instruments. The kris blade, with its distinctive wavy form, was believed to carry spiritual power, and in the hands of someone who had trained for years, it was devastatingly effective. Kali, the Filipino martial art, is today recognized as one of the most complete combat systems ever developed. It integrates blade work, empty hand techniques, and battlefield awareness into a single fluid discipline. Warriors trained to fight against multiple opponents. Simultaneously, they trained to transition instantly between armed and unarmed combat. They trained to win. And they did win, repeatedly, against kingdoms that were larger, sometimes wealthier, sometimes better positioned geographically. The edge was always the warrior, the training, the discipline, the cultural pride that made retreat feel worse than death. Here is the detail that reframes everything. When Ferdinand Magellan arrived in the Philippines in 1521, he did not find a land of passive, unorganized people waiting to be civilized. He found Raja Humabon of Cebu, a sophisticated ruler managing trade and tribute relationships across the region. He found Datu Lapu-Lapu of Mactan, a lord who had already refused to pay tribute to Humabon because he answered to no one. And when Magellan attempted to use Spanish military force to compel Lapu-Lapu's submission, he died on that beach, killed in the Battle of Mactan by warriors fighting on their own ground, under their own flag, for their own sovereignty. That was not a lucky ambush. That was the product of centuries of military culture, of kingdoms forged in constant competition, of warriors who had been defeating enemies their entire lives. The Spanish did eventually colonize the Philippines, but it took them decades of grinding effort, strategic alliances with some kingdoms against others, and a level of political maneuvering that colonial histories tend to gloss over. They did not walk into an empty land. They walked into a world of power, and they knew it. So why don't we know this story? Part of the answer is colonial. When Spain established control, they systematically suppressed indigenous records. The written history of the Philippines, in Baybayin script, on perishable materials like bamboo and leaves was largely destroyed or allowed to decay. The victors wrote the narrative, and they wrote themselves as civilizers arriving in darkness. Part of the answer is archaeological. Unlike stone-building civilizations, many Philippine kingdoms built in wood and bamboo, materials that do not survive centuries in tropical humidity. The physical evidence is harder to find. And part of the answer is simply that the story was inconvenient. An archipelago of sovereign, sophisticated, militarily powerful kingdoms does not fit neatly into the story that colonialism needed to tell about itself. But the truth survives. In oral traditions, in the few written records that escaped destruction, like the Laguna copperplate inscription dated 900 CE, which proves complex literate civilization in the Philippines over 1,000 years ago. In the genetic record, in the martial arts still practiced today, in the blood of a people who were never, in their own minds, conquered. The kingdoms are gone. The empires have no thrones, but the legacy is alive. Every time a Filipino practices arnis, the national martial art descended from ancient Kali, they are connecting to a warrior tradition that defeated 50 kingdoms. Every time the story of Lapu-Lapu is told, the ghost of pre-colonial sovereignty speaks. Every archaeological find, every translated inscription, every recovered artifact pulls another piece of the true history back into the light. And there is a growing movement of historians, archaeologists, and ordinary Filipinos who are refusing to let this story stay buried, who are insisting that Philippine history did not begin with colonization, that there was a world before the galleons, that it was magnificent. Before you move on, if this history matters to you, hit that subscribe button right now. Every video we make is dedicated to recovering the stories that power tried to erase. You do not want to miss what's coming next. Here is what I want you to take away from this. The Philippines was not a blank page that history wrote upon. It was already a book, dense, complex, full of war and art and law and empire. A book that was partially burned, partially buried, partially forgotten. But books have a way of surviving. The hidden war was real. The 50 kingdoms were real. The warriors who defeated them were real. And the civilization they built, proud, sovereign, and powerful, was real. History does not always belong to the conquerors. Sometimes it belongs to the ones who keep remembering. This has been your deep dive into the Philippines' forgotten empire.
Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.